Eric Hayot, Humanist Reason, a history, an argument, a plan. We'll get to the plan, but I want to start with the title concept, Humanist Reason, which sounds familiar when you encounter it, but it turns out that, humanist reason is kind of like a tertiary phrase in, discussions about humanism and discussions about theology, but not really about the humanities. So can you light that up for us, humanist reason?
Well, so, I mean, part of, the reason humanist reason sounds strange is because it's modeled on this other phrase, scientific reason, which everyone knows, and every school child in certainly in the United States learns at some point that there's something called the scientific method, which teaches you how to understand things about nature and the world and so on and so forth, and that it's a series of procedures that were developed and are a great achievement of Western civilization that that lead to knowledge. And the humanities at the same time labor under a set of conditions that and mythologies or judgments that involve sort of imagining that what humanists do, by contrast to the scientific thing that everyone knows is important and good and methodical, humanists kind of make things up, right? Or humanists tell stories, or humanists engage in acts of understanding. And one of the primary arguments of the book is that, in fact, humanists know things. They know things through a series of procedures that can be described and explained, that these procedures produce knowledge that is effective in the world, that is, that it changes the world, and that is subject to processes of reason as I and Max Weber and a number of other people understand them to be legitimate. That is to say, and here let me just say that one of the struggles of the book was to think about what word to use when I wanted to describe what humanists do, to come up with, how do you describe how humanists know and how humanists know legitimately? That is, you and I are humanists. We're talking about whether something happened a certain way, or we're talking about whether something means a certain thing, or why something happened in the way that we think it happens, or what the historical or social or cultural meaning of that was, or what the historical, social, or cultural value of an artwork was. How do we know what we know in ways that we all agree are legitimate? And one of the things that humanists of my generation certainly know is that, in fact, the very idea of reason has often been used in highly suspicious and creepy and violent even ways to impose a vision of knowing or a vision of the world onto people, often not the people who were dominant in the society that was doing the imposing. So often women, often queer people, often non-white people, often colonized people, impose a vision of the world on them that was, in fact, not exactly reasonable, but simply an expression of power. Mm-hmm. And so, I grew up as a graduate student in the 90s, knowing that reason was something you should be pretty suspicious of. And so, one of the things the book begins with is this encounter for me of this idea that, on the one hand, I know that reason is this highly suspicious, tendentious thing that's been used in these very particular ways. And on the other hand, I believe I know things. And I believe you know things, and I believe that humanists know things. And many of the things I know because other humanists have asserted them and said they've known them in various kinds of ways. And so I think that they're things we know. And so what does it mean that we both are suspicious of the word reason, but not suspicious of the word know? And then that is, we can know things, and in fact, not suspicious at all of the act of knowing. And I think have lots of evidence in front of us that can be very persuasive about the fact that we know things, and that we don't just know things because they come to us in a dream, but we know things through procedures that we share. And I decided to call that reason because it seemed to me, first of all, there was a definition of reason from Max Weber, the German sociologist, that I thought was compatible with what I know about the history of reason. That is compatible, that wasn't simply a reproduction of a kind of reason in which one says, I'm right and you're wrong, or here are the correct ways of knowing and here are the incorrect ways of knowing, and only the correct ways of knowing give us answers that are correct, but rather a notion of reason that was fundamentally dialogical, fundamentally democratic, and fundamentally shareable. That is that what reason means to me in practice historically has been that we can teach each other things. You can teach me something. I can teach you something. And indeed, you can teach me something, Paul, about something that you know a great deal about. And then by digesting what you've taught me, I can then give you back something about that very thing that is your thing that you didn't know.
That's the dialogic bit.
Right. That's the dialogic bit. That reason must be dialogic. And if for it to be dialogic, it has to be therefore open. Right. And the reason is not top down. Reason is the product of a shared conversation. And it's a conversation in which no one has all the goods. Right. No one has all the tools. It's not a conversation in which people who know things vomit their knowledge onto the people who don't know things, who collect it merrily in buckets. But rather in which people who know things share things with each other and make available to each other the tools with which they know, such that anyone can then know what other people know, right? And again, the outline of the model of this is already in Weber 100 years ago, but it seems to me that this dialogical model of reason is compatible with what I feel and think as a humanist already. That is the political values I hold, but also compatible with what happens a lot of the time, not all of the time. Of course, there are jerks, there are humanist jerks. Even in humanism, there are jerks. Even in the humanities, there are people who are impose in jerky ways their ideas on others. But the model of what we're talking about is modeled, I think, for us both in humanist scholarship and in humanist institutions. Again, not always ideally, and in humanist friendships and in humanist conferences and so on and so forth. And so this dialogic model of reason, I want to assert, is reason in every way that one could imagine. It's not the bad reason, it's the good reason. And my claim is not that humanists are the only place that this good reason has always existed, and that there's this other bad reason that we need to get rid of. I mean, I think that good and bad reason exist alongside one another, but it seemed to me important to claim the idea of reason, rather than simply say, because reason has been used in these bad and tendentious and overwhelming or dominating ways, that we should get rid of the term entirely. Because it seemed to me that we ought to do a better job of saying, no, this thing that is described as reason, and that describes itself as reason, that does these things, is not the only way for reason to exist. Reason exists in these other ways, and we have plenty of evidence that it does, and the evidence is in our books and in our classrooms and in our articles and in our conversations. And we need to assert, I think, the value of that and name that reason, not only for our own, let's say our own self-respect, but also because I think that it not doing so blocks us from becoming or recognizing all that we are and we have been as humanist thinkers.
I want to ask you about the we that you just used there, because early on in the introduction to the book, you say that economists don't think humanist knowledge produces truth. So are you writing this book predominantly to those economists in an effort to persuade them that humanist knowledge is truth, or are you writing to the we, or to the second person address, the you, that you sometimes use in deeper into the book?
It would be nice. First of all, let's just agree that there are a lot of people out there, including some economists, one of whom in particular I mentioned because I just happen to have an encounter with him, but who basically don't think humanist reason, that it's the work of the humanities, produces actual knowledge, right? That it's just the product of kind of a series of political commitments or a set of feelings or a set of kind of emotional structures, that it's feminized in that sense, that, right, that knowledge is masculine and has numbers and is hard and so on and so forth and rigorous, and that humanities knowledge is feeling and understanding and so on and so forth. Not that there's anything wrong with feeling and understanding, but there's something very wrong with the sort of negative articulation of that binary. Right. So I think we need to stipulate at the outset that one of the problems the book is trying to resolve is the terrible reputation that humanist knowledge has in the world right now. And the ways in which that reputation or the set of attitudes that govern that reputation justify slashing humanities departments, mocking humanities majors, and so on and so forth, around a series of mythologies about the fact that humanities majors don't get jobs, and so on and so forth, right? So all of that exists and is real and important. Those people need to be convinced. And in a perfect world, they would be partially convinced by this book. But the real people I'm trying to convince are humanists themselves. That is that I think one of the things the book is really about is the degree to which scholars in the humanities, historians, literature scholars, philosophers, scholars of society and culture, have, because of some reasons that I lay out in the book, I think, but it doesn't really matter why, but continually articulate defenses of the humanities that seem to me to fail to respond robustly to the most common critiques of the humanities, and also fail, and this is really important, to actually understand what the humanities are and do. That is that my argument in the book is that there's a discourse of defense of the humanities that is mostly driven by humanists that sounds great and is convincing and very powerful and moving often, but that does not actually describe what humanist scholarship looks like. And what I would like to do as a first step, so I think the first step is to convince the people on our side, whatever that our is. But here, I welcome anyone who thinks of themselves as a humanist. You don't have to have a PhD. Anyone who has ever gotten anything out of a college class in English, history, philosophy, literature, language, culture, the places that have programs called government as opposed to political science. Anyone who's ever gotten anything out of that class who felt in the moment of their learning or their teaching that there was value there for them, that something made sense about the world and that they actually grew in relation to that understanding. That's the we that I'm talking to. And I recognize that's a big old we, and not everybody in that we looks like you and me, and not everybody in that we thinks like you and me. And I've tried to write a book that's as open to as many people of that type as I could, and to say, we need to think of what we do in a different way. And the way is probably chapter 3 of the book. The first 2 parts of the book are here's how we think, here's why we think, and so on and so forth. Then part 3 is this is what I think we need to think about the way that we think.
Let's talk about part 3, because I think part of the openness of this book is in that third bit of your subtitle, a plan. And that chapter 3, I think, is where a lot of that plan is. And the chapter is called Articles of Reason, How Humanists Really Ought to, in parentheses, think. So I want to ask you about that. There are not a lot of academic monographs in the humanities that have a plan, or certainly that have articles of anything in the sort of Articles of Confederation, Articles of Human Rights sense.
I was thinking 2 things. So first of all, I was raised in France. And so when I think of the word plan, I always think of the French word plan, which is not just a plan going forward, but also a kind of blueprint of something. Or it could be a blueprint is of course an image of a building that doesn't yet exist, but it could also be an image of a building that exists perfectly well. And you can use the blueprint to find out, where the plumbing connectors are. So the plan that I lay out is both a description of what I think humanist work really does, and my evidence is the history of humanist work in the last 150 years or so. So I have plenty of evidence in front of me. That is on the basis of this work. What do I think the basic principles governing humanist reason are? That is, what do I think is something that everyone can agree on, and something that mostly everyone does, and again, even if they don't know that they're doing it, that they do it. In some way, and these are the kind of basic structures. I call it Articles of Reason because I was thinking, of course, of Articles of Faith, and it seemed to me really important to imagine. So the book I wrote before this was a writing book, right? And the writing book was a book about how to think structurally about how you are expressing yourself in ways that increase your force and power as a writer, and increase your ability to move your reader and engage your reader, and somehow manage the relationship between what you want to accomplish as a writer and what the reader experiences as a reader. And a lot of that was structural advice. It was a list of things. Well, here, try this, do this at the level of the sentence. It was a craft manual in some sense. And I think of Articles of Reason as essentially a craft manual for thinking. The difference, of course, is that it's very similar. In some sense, a lot of the insight of the writing book that I wrote was that people were already doing things. One of the examples I deal with at length is this series of paragraphs by a guy named Barry McRae, a scholar you know and I know, who's great, a beautiful writer. And I showed how Barry McRae was using strategies and structures that I could describe with words. But Barry McRae has never learned to write. He was not a student of mine. He's our age. He just was using them without knowing he was using them. My claim similarly would be that the Articles of Reason are a series of strategies, principles, governing epistemological arguments that most people in the humanities are already using, but don't know that they're using or wouldn't describe them in this particular way, right? That's the blueprint part. That is, I'm trying to create a blueprint for how humanists are already thinking. But at the same time, what the blueprint, of course, allows you to do if you don't have one, let's say you were living in a house, you don't have a blueprint, is the blueprint, once you see the blueprint, you can, among other things, explain, first of all, you understand the house better than you did before the blueprint. So you understand yourself in a new way, right? So description is not just, as we know, why do we know this? Because humanists taught us this, right? Description is not just a laying out of facts. It's actually potentially, not always, potentially a transformative experience, right? Which is why it matters what we call people, right? Why we fight so hard over words, because the way you describe someone, right, who's transgender, for instance, the words you describe someone with not only describe a set of facts, but describe, in fact, a whole set of possibilities that are inherent in the description. Likewise, right? So humanists know this. My claim would be humanists know this. Everyone knows this who's going to watch this video, I think, right? And even if you don't know it, we've had fights over words. What words do we use to describe things? Not just groups of people, but obviously groups of people, but all kinds of stuff, right? This knowledge is in us. And my argument is that if we can describe this, first of all, we can teach it. Second of all, we can see it in ourselves and use that knowledge, because knowledge is different from a house. How? Because we're always building the house of knowledge, right? We're mostly satisfied with the houses we live in, not everybody, but that the house of knowledge is a project. And so knowing how it works and knowing what's connected to what and what the basic ideas are is really, for me, not just an act of description, but an act of empowerment. The goal is to say to people, here are some things you think. Some of them you may know, some of them you may not know. But if you put all these together, this is the pattern of the structure of humanist reason today. And here are the ways in which this pattern of structure is powerful. Here are the conclusions it draws. Here's the evidence it uses. Here's its attitude towards evidence. If you master this, and this is a little bit like the writing book, right? The writing book is a series of strategies and tactics. And then you take those strategies and tactics and you write your own book. You don't write my book, right? You write your book. And in a perfect world, your book teaches me something I didn't know, because that's teaching. Right? Teaching isn't convincing people of something. Teaching is giving people something to do something with. So likewise, this is a set of things. It's not maybe a perfect set. It's the best set that I could come up with now. But the idea is that you take this and you think your own thoughts, not that you think then my thoughts, but you think the thoughts that are available to you, that have been made available to you in a slightly new way. And hopefully that's empowering and powerful for the readers of the book.
Like anyone who's publishing a book in 2020 or early 2021, you wrote this book in a world that looked pretty different from the world in which it will appear. So I want to ask you how you think humanist reason speaks in general to what we've been calling for a long time now, the crisis in the humanities, but also to its particular incarnation in the COVID and post-COVID world.
Well, I mean, there are two things to say. One is that this book is not a solution to the institutional crisis in the humanities, which, as I say somewhere in the book, I think probably at the end, is the result of a 5 or 6 decade long campaign by forces that I think are both political and economic to destroy the possibility of democratic knowledge. It's been mostly until now a losing campaign. Which is to say the humanities, I think, continue to produce knowledge that changes the world. They haven't gotten rid of us yet, despite some big efforts, and they haven't gotten rid of undergraduate programs yet. But we see very clearly in this situation, that the crisis management of a certain version of, the shock doctrine that Naomi Klein has talked about, is producing preferential cuts that destroy humanities programs. Just University of Evansville in Indiana announced that it was cutting a series of departments, though interestingly and incidentally, they're cutting computer science and engineering as well as their entire history major. Astounding, right? Astounding. University of Vermont, same thing. So we see this process, which I don't think my book will do too much to arrest. But I do think that one of the things I'm trying to give people who defend the humanities a language for is a language of defense of the humanities that does not rely on what has been, for me, an essentially failed series of defenses of the humanities going back 100 years. And I review some of those in the book. Whatever we can say about the defense of the humanities, it's that though they've been very good at making humanists feel good about what they do, they've actually not been very successful in some respects. And so part of what I'm interested in doing is trying to come up with a more robust, more aggressive defense. I think, I know a stronger theory. I know you've written about strong and weak theory, but it's a stronger theory of the humanities, and it's not a weak theory of the humanities. But I think it's a strong theory of the humanities and of humanistic work that makes it clear why the humanities must be defended to the death by those of us who are in it. But also why any university worth its salt ought to include them. And I think finally, why any society worth its salt ought to fund the study of them. One of the things I say in the book, for instance, is that I invite the reader to imagine how many people alive today have not had their personal experience of their own gender changed or shaped by the humanities. And so I'm not talking about just people who've read Judith Butler in their senior seminar at a small liberal arts college. I'm talking about all of the legal doctrine, the UN policies, the wave of global culture, the inclusion of queer and trans people in our films and our novels, the inclusion of novels by queer and trans people. I am talking about policies involving women's rights, involving for instance, the Me Too movement, which is worldwide at this point, involving the basic gestures of feminism, including the women's right to vote. So when we're not just talking about the last 10 years, these things have emerged from the humanities and have affected as many people's lives as has any great scientific discovery of the last 300 years, electricity, steam, whatever you want. If we can't fight for that, and that's one example. There are other examples, right? There are other examples. Many of them are smaller, some of them are equally sized, whatever it is. But this is just, when we think about what is the value of humanistic knowledge, my claim is this is knowledge. It's not a set of political attitudes. It's knowledge based on, it's not knowledge about empirical facts. It's knowledge about the way society could be based on historical research, logical argumentation, right? Semiotic analysis of various kinds, right? It's parasitic, of course, as all knowledge is, all humanist knowledge is, on the history of art, on the history of human being, on the history of society, on the history of individual interactions and love. Because that's the material that we have, in the same way that the scientist's material, the biological scientist's material is the cell, right? That knowledge has changed the way we all live, as much as any bridge has changed the way people cross rivers. And if we can see the humanities as both, and humanist reason as the process that creates that kind of knowledge, and the outcome that shapes and puts that knowledge into practice at the individual level, any one of you watching today, how you feel, right? Think about how you feel, and the things that were available to you, or the things that are available to, if you have children, to your children that weren't available to you. Just the basic infrastructure, the sentimental and institutional and cultural infrastructure that's available to you or to your children. That change was wrought by the work of humanist reason. And that's not just the only change. It's one of many, many changes. And that seems really worth fighting for. And so what I want to insist on is that we do things, we know things, and we use the things we know to do things. And the things we do matter a great deal. They matter a great deal to all of us. And the terms on which we can fight for that need to be and ought to be much more proud and aggressive and less defensive and conciliatory than they have been. And one of the things I say in the book is, that people are trying to destroy the humanities, not because we're weak and easily destroyed and have no influence, but because we're strong and because we've changed the world. And the question is, what does that look like when you think of the humanities as that thing, rather than the beleaguered thing that most of us experience when we feel, as we do over and over in this world, that we're under attack, that we're in crisis, that we're beleaguered and damaged.
Would you go as far as to say that humanist reason is better than scientific reason?
I don't think it's a contest in that sense. But one of the things that I did confront writing that last section of the book is finally that what I really think, and I didn't say this anywhere because I think it's obnoxious, I actually think that scientific reason is essentially a subset of humanist reason. I don't think that humanist reason is modeled on scientific reason. I mean, again, if you look at the historical record, the claim I'm making is absolutely false. They were certainly tendentious. But scientific reason has this tremendous advantage, which is that it doesn't deal with things with minds. And humanist reason does. And things with minds turn out to be really complicated. Really complicated. They're full of desire, they're full of contradiction, right? They're filled up, their sort of causal structuration overflows the containers that we imagine it to hold. And what that means is that our objects are just really complicated, really complicated. I would love, honestly, if you told me that I could somehow reduce a novel to the simplicity of a series of chemical reactions, untrammeled by an environment, but even trammeled by an environment whose inputs I understood pretty well and could mathematize and quantify, that'd be amazing. But it turns out that that doesn't explain a lot, and it hasn't explained a lot because, in fact, again, my claim would be it's of a level of complexity, of emotional complexity, of psychological complexity, and I don't mean just humans. And when I say beings with minds, I'm trying to be generous here. Dogs can have PTSD, right? Beings with minds are complicated as hell, and they're complicated because they're social. And they're also complicated because they are perfectly capable, as we know from all of our own lived experience, of living in the midst of radical, complex contradictions of, for instance, finding tremendous strength and access to violence through their own subjugation to another person. Right. We've seen, we're living it, right? We're living a world in which we see how many of our co-inhabitants of these United States are empowered by their own subjugation to a vision of a man who, for some of us, who seems shockingly not worth worshiping. And some people seem to imagine that if you just explain to these people that their self-interest lies with voting for the Democratic Party and so on and so forth, that and economically, whatever, right, Joe Biden, that you would get, you would somehow, like, if you could just talk to them enough, it would work. But it doesn't work, and it hasn't worked. And the reason it hasn't worked is because people are complicated. It would be great if people were simple. We'd already be living in, someone's utopia. Whether that's Adam Smith or Karl Marx, I don't know, but someone's utopia, because we would know how to manage things. But we're not where, the humanities is the study of the species, and it's the study of the species as a biological form of emergence on a single planet in a very particular historical way. And we are what we are, and this is what we have to study. And so it's, to me, it's the most exciting project in the known universe.
Will you
because
just go back and close the loop of how, for you, scientific reason may be a kind of subset of humanist reason?
I mean, it's a subset because it's the simpler version. I mean, the genius of science as a kind of, again, as a mythology of itself, because we know that real science and the real practice of science is actually done by humans. It's not done by machines, or it's done by machines made by humans, which amounts to the same thing. And the real practice of science is really rich and complex and full of personal rivalry and mistakes and institutional structures and so on. The anthropology of science has shown us that very, very, very clearly. But the mythology of science, as it presents itself to us, but also the things scientists study, are at some level involve such a small number of controllable variables that the evidence can be contained and managed before one, as in a laboratory, in ways, for instance, think about our management of the COVID vaccine. We're essentially describing the social management of a virus. And we're, I think, in the long run, going to be very successful at it, because we understand the virus much better than the virus understands itself, but also the virus doesn't have desire. Despite all the kinds of the virus wants to infect, or the virus is doing this and that. Right? The virus doesn't, it just does what it does. But we, by contrast, has it ever taken we have problems that are right in front of our faces, the problems of poverty and injustice and unkindness and violence and domination. That we cannot solve. And it would be great, maybe, if we could solve them as easily as we solve the virus, but we can't solve them, not because we don't know what the solutions are, because, most of us would agree that we ought to live in a world where, people aren't mistreated, but because we don't know what the procedures are whereby we arrive at those solutions. And it's specifically the procedures, both the axiological, which is to say value-oriented procedures, which is, even the most basic axiological procedure of saying something like a woman's life is worth the same as a man's life, or a transgendered person's life is worth the same as a cisgendered person's life, or a black life is worth the same as a white life, and that we ought to fight for that. Those procedures, and then the questions of how do we create the understanding of the truth of those, or of the knowledge of those procedures, and then how do we put those procedures into practice socially, both at the level of institutions, political and legal institutions, but also academic institutions, scholarly institutions, banking and economic institutions, and so on and so forth. These are the very stuff of the humanities. And so when I say scientific reason is a subset, I think the principles I describe in the Articles of Reason section of the book are very, very clear. And I think that most scientists would share them. It's just that when I say something like, causality, which I think is all humanists believe, that causality is effectively multiscalar and complex and characterized by interactions between several different levels of cause that cannot be adequately disentangled from one another. Scientists might agree with that, but it's true that in the case of the interaction of molecules with one another in a petri dish, you can actually eliminate many of those structures, right, such that you've radically simplified the problem. And in that sense, I think scientific reason, as we understand it and as we know it today, is essentially a kind of simplified subset of the larger procedures of reasoning that I'm describing in the book.
So in a sense, you've written a book called Humanist Reason, whose secret name is reason.
Reason. Yeah. I think humanist reason is reason. I think humanist reason is reason. It is. It's just reason. It's what we all have and what we all have going for us. And the insane, it seems to me, in a Freudian sense, that again, Freud gives us the tools we need to understand this. The radically interesting story of the last 200 or 300 years is that, or 400 years, let's say, is that, and you can understand exactly why this would happen. You don't actually have to have read Freud, is that people have fastened on to the idea that there is this very narrow kind of reason that has given us wonderful things, vaccines, electricity, or the internet, Zoom, that because it's so good at solving certain kinds of problems, should be used to solve all the problems. And of course, why not? You can see why someone would feel that way. But what allows you to see how someone would feel that way is humanist reason. And what allows you to see that, in fact, again, the evidence suggests pretty fucking clearly that the model of thinking we call scientific reason cannot solve those problems is that we haven't solved them. And the reason we haven't solved them is because we're humans. And ultimately, humans are the ones who are doing the science. So, in that sense, again, humanist reason is the larger category. If you want to understand what science is, you don't ask a molecule, ask a sociologist.